Hi, and welcome to this presentation. This is going to be sort of a snippet of what the workshop will look like that I'm preparing for the Humanities Washington Speakers Bureau application. And this presentation will really focus on sort of an overview of immigration policies, the impact that that has on specifically US children of immigrants, and then also what we can do in our communities to best support our individuals who are immigration impacted in our community. So I've titled this presentation, which will also serve as the workshop that I propose to do as US citizens and the weight of the private safety net. Before I begin this sort of short version of the workshop, I want to talk a little bit about who I am, what is the work that I do, and really why do I engage in such work. First, I'm an assistant professor of sociology at Washington State University. I'm also an alumni from Washington State University, and so this is very much home for me. And as an educator, I think one of the biggest things that I try to focus on is how we can leverage resources and really knowledge available to us to be able to support our students. And so, really, from the stance of the workshop, is to try to support all members of our community. And I do that in the capacity of serving as an educator. My role as an educator is also in terms of being a professor, which means I have specific expertise on immigrant communities, both historically and with contemporary. And some of that work is going to be used in this presentation to be able to showcase sort of the impact that that has on contemporary immigrant families. I'm also deeply connected to doing issues like this in this workshop that focus on immigrant families because I myself am from Washington. I'm from a small town named Prosser, Washington, which is really in between Yakima and Tri Cities in central Washington. And I grew up in an immigrant family, right? And so a lot of these issues that I discussed today are things that are really uniquely connected to something that I grew up with and are issues that I still face still to this day. And so a lot of these issues that we'll discuss are things that I have a personal connection to and that personally connect me to trying to make our communities a better place for immigrants because I was a child of immigrants growing up and I also have roots in the state of Washington as well. One of the things that I'm going to draw on heavily through this workshop is really highlighting the historical aspect of how immigration laws have come to be in this way, right? And so it's not only just leveraging, what's going on in the world around us today, but also seeing how that, those images that we might see or things that we might read about in the newspaper or media sites today have a history, right? So I'm going to be drawing a lot on over 10 decade or over 10 years of experience working with immigrant families and also conducting research on immigrant families, specifically Latino families, although I'll touch on, across race and ethnicity. And so I really want to underscore sort of these experiences of why, both personally and professionally, I engage in the work that I do. I also want to turn it over to you, although right now we are sort of in a more demo stage. What I would do in this part of the workshop is turn to participants, whether it's on Zoom or in person, to get a better sense of who's in the audience. And so, although we don't have time to, pair share among the group to try to understand who's here and, what background you come from and so forth, um, I expect that a lot of people in this workshop are going to be perhaps educators themselves, right? Maybe not just at the university level like myself, but perhaps in the K through 12, right? And so you frequently come across immigrant communities or students who have either immigrant parents or are immigrants themselves, right? And so perhaps that's why you're here and you hope to better understand, what's going on in this community and how we could help. You might also be, sort of the second picture, community members or community leaders, right, that are interested in working alongside such communities. Or you might just be an activist, right, where you're actively engaging in, leveraging laws, advocating for certain policies, advocating for strengthening the policies that we perhaps have, and really trying to push for, better and more equal policies for our community members. So here I just really want to assess who's in the room and what resources are you bringing in and what unique talents are in the audience. And knowing and understanding that, we'll be able to go back to that after I do the presentation, and really leverage that at the end of the workshop. So some of the goals for the workshop. So today, of course, this is a much quicker overview, but in the broader workshop, you will learn a little bit about federal and state immigration policies that impact both undocumented and mixed status families in Washington. And by mixed status, here we mean where at least one family member is an undocumented immigrant. In many cases, that means US born citizen children who have undocumented parents, right? And so we're going to learn a little bit of the history of, what's gone on, how did we get here, and, really get it to present day. With that being said, as I mentioned earlier on, I'm a professor and a researcher. And so we're also going to draw an ode into the second point, we're going to become aware of how immigration policies are actually affecting immigrant families on the ground, right? And so after I provide the historical overview, which is sort of point one, we'll move into more concrete sort of research examples from data I've collected over the years. To better understand what is the impact that immigration policies and specifically growing up with an undocumented parent have for US born children of immigrants? What is the impact that it has earlier in their life, but then also later on? And then the third part of the workshop is really getting back to who's in the audience, really trying to think about how can we leverage what is available to us to strengthen our community, strengthen our ties across organizations, and really all of us work together to support members of this community. And again, you might be part of this community, or you might be in a position where you actively work very closely with members of this community. And so again, having the knowledge and the history and the background, coupled with understanding the research of what does research tell us of how these laws impact families on the ground, then we'll move into that third point where we try to understand what can we do about these issues. I want to give a very quick overview of sort of the snapshot of undocumented immigrants and mixed status families here, specifically in our state, in the state of Washington. For the sake of time, I'm unable to touch on the federal, but for here, the purposes of Washington, there are over 1 million immigrants in the state of Washington. And now this can range from individuals who are here with what we call permanent statuses, right? That could be naturalized citizens, that could be lawful permanent residents, that could be people who have temporary protected status, refugee status, and so forth, right? But in terms of undocumented immigrants, among those 1 million, we do have about 1 in 4 immigrants that are considered undocumented immigrants, right? And essentially, what that means is that those specific immigrants do not have proper legal authority to be here in the United States, right? And so, what that means is that they face a number of different barriers, which we'll talk about in the slides to come. In terms of young people, we also see that we have about, and our best estimates suggest about 2,000, but a lot of that can be underreported, right? Because we have to understand that the way that we ask some of these things, people might not feel comfortable sharing that information. So we have about 2,000 undocumented students that graduate each year, but that likely is a lot higher than what is reported. And a lot of these young people are not eligible for DACA, which is Deferred Action for Childhood Arrival. Because during the first Trump administration, those work permits were rescinded, right? And so now we have a lot of young people who are coming of age, entering, perhaps the workforce, or also going off to college, which where I work, that don't necessarily have access to work permits. What we see is that the majority are coming from Latin American countries, individuals who are part of undocumented and mixed status families, but there is a growing undocumented Asian population, right? Specifically when we're talking about like King County, for instance, right? And so that's really important for us to consider and think about as we're working with undocumented immigrants. That undocumented immigrants are not just Latino immigrants, right? And that a lot of our students or young people that are coming of age are actually also Asian, which are actually the most growing population of undocumented immigrants, right? And so it's important for us to understand that so we don't silence their struggles. So we live in a fairly immigrant-friendly state relative to other states. right? And so here in the state of Washington, we do have driver's license for all Washington residents, right? Also, we have a lot of college access policies, right? So for undocumented students who are graduating in our high schools, we provide in-state tuition, right? So it allows us to be considered as residents, right? Because formerly they were considered as sort of international students, and meaning that they were paying, 3 times as much. And then also we have in-state financial aid, right, with LAFSA. And that provides them a little bit of support financially to be able to go off to college because we know that college is quite expensive. And also these students are ineligible for federal support, right? So this is where things like our programs like WAFSA really help out our students. We also have the Keep Washington Working Act, which really limits how much law enforcement is able to enforce federal immigration laws, right? And really, this policy was put in place to be able to ensure that our undocumented residents in Washington were really focused on working, maintaining, being part of their communities and their families, and not necessarily worried about being deported if they were stopped by the police here in Washington. And then most recently, this is a new one that happened in July 2024, is that in most professional licenses that we have in the state of Washington, whether it's plumbing, whether it's teacher certifications and so forth, you usually needed a social security number in order to be able to apply for those things. So the state of Washington last summer allowed us to be able to remove that barrier. So now students who are undocumented are able to move on to be, speech therapist, psychologist, physicians, dentists, and can engage in a number of different occupation licenses, even if they don't have that social security number. So now let's talk a little bit about sort of that second point of our goals with the workshop, right? Is what does it mean to grow up with an undocumented immigrant? What does the research say? And so what our research really finds is that there's a huge number of spillover negative effects that happen to US citizen children with undocumented parents. We know that these children are more likely to live in poverty, right? Because children are very dependent upon what their parents are able to do. They face a lot of housing instability, and there's a lot of organizations here in the state of Washington who are actively working with undocumented communities because we know that without a social security number, it makes it really difficult to be able to apply to certain apartment complexes. It creates barriers to buying a home, right, and so forth. There's also issues in terms of immobility, right? And feeling scared, like you can't go to certain places or you feel scared to drive and so forth, right? And we still see some of that, those fears come about even if we have driver's licenses in the state. And then ultimately the fear of family separation, right? Feeling like what would happen to my parents if they were to be deported. Now, we know that if a family member or just families in general do experience deportation, that only exacerbates all these issues, right? That means young people have to consider who's going to take care of me? Who's going to, is it going to be somebody here? Are there relatives here in the state of Washington that are going to support me? Are they going to be put in the foster care system? Are they going to go back, to the country of origin, right? And it is those specific experiences that position young people to experience homelessness, right? And then we have so much research from our colleagues in psychology that talk about how much anxiety and depression and really stress deportation can cause on a US born child of undocumented immigrants. And in fact, we have new research that talks about how deportation is so devastating for US born children of immigrants that it fundamentally rewires their brain. The stress is so much that it rewires their brain in different ways compared to those young adults that don't experience that trauma. Coming of age, and this is really sort of where my research also focuses, is what happens to these young people when they come of age. And coming of age, really, if we think about sort of the title, that weight of the private safety net, it really creates a lot new opportunities for these youngsters to support their undocumented parents. This might mean becoming legal guardians, financially supporting, taking on credit card debt to help the parents, right? And especially if we're thinking about healthcare and their parents getting older, and then just a greater cognitive pressure of thinking, how can I support my parents? Because I'm a citizen, I could work lawfully, I'm able to have access to things that my parents are not. That puts a lot of pressure on young adults, right? And these pressures, sort of this weight of the private safety net, can also result in a number of different added responsibilities. And what I've seen in my research is that young people simply turn down educational opportunities, right? And so if we have young people in central Washington, it's not uncommon to see that going to a place like the University of Washington or Washington State, which, relatively 3 hours away, that's too far to support my parents. They need me closer by, right? And so we see that a lot of young people choose to stay very close by to their parents instead of pursuing these different opportunities. And I've even seen in my research that a lot of these young people choose to limit their spending because they're helping their parents financially and even consider limiting future child rearing, right? And so if we look at sort of the future that we want in terms of economic support and what this means for future family formation, these young people are really making decisions to limit and restrict these things because of their parents' exclusion, right? Which really, gets us to think about how can we create policies, programming, and support on the ground to really foster, sort of a more inclusive environment to ensure that US citizen children, and especially when they become adults, are able to experience sort of full range adulthood rather than be harpered down by their parents' immigration status. Oops. So this is sort of where the third part of the workshop comes in. And although we won't be able to go through it intensely in this workshop demo, I do sort of want to highlight that understanding the history, sort of the different immigration policies, how did we get there, understanding the impact that it has for the US citizen children of undocumented immigrants, we move on to thinking about, well, what are concrete ways that we can support? And in the workshop, I'll go over a number of different things, right? Whereas community partnerships and what that could look like, changing administrative policies or just policies in the workplace or in the schools, K through 12 or at universities, working on one-on-one relationships and how you can do that, and also how we can empower these community members themselves, right? Because they are also people with agency, and we want to make sure that they are also centered always in these conversations. At this part of the workshop, we would move into a small group activity where, we kind of go back to that first question that I asked, who are you and, what is your background and, what is your expertise and what do you bring to the table? And in this situation, we would sort of group, people, whether it's working with K through 12, community leaders or activists to really share, what is going on? How can we leverage the resources that we have or the specific position that we hold in the community to really uphold and support immigrant students and their undocumented parents. After that, we would come together as a group to share what are the things that we learn and really collectively, depending on who are the audience, think about how can we support and what are the unique ways that we can really leverage our local communities to be able to create change on the ground. And I say this also because as federal policies continue to change and the landscape becomes, much more arduous and difficult for immigrant communities, it's really going to be up to us, community members on the ground, to really leverage, living in a state like Washington, where we are afforded, a lot of great opportunities and legal protections. But how can we foster that even further on the ground? And that's really what I want my participants to take away from, is to feel empowered and not boggled down by the information that I'm sharing. At this point in time, I would wrap up, right? And really, give an ode to the participants for showing up, learning about immigration policies, but also reminding them to really be kind to themselves in this difficult time, right? The mere fact that they would show up shows me that they're very committed to creating change and supporting immigration impacted people in their communities. And again, they might be of that community as well. But to also remind ourselves that we are facing a very difficult time and it's okay to be kind to yourself and know that you're not going to understand or know every single thing that's coming our way. Really, what this workshop is supposed to be is informative, but then also thinking about, well, what is it that you bring to the table that can help support and create some change? And it could be small, right? Whether it's working with students, right, or advocating for a little bit more support if you're in the K through 12 system, for instance, people like me who are at the university having conversations about how can we best support and live up to our land grant missions and so forth. But really recognizing that immigrant families really face a number of different barriers and that we all have the power to be able to support them, whether it's through being educators, community leaders, activists. All of us can do something, whether it's big or small, to be able to ease their transition. And that is what the hope of the workshop is for those that come and participate. With that being said, I will stop screen sharing and I will wrap up the presentation. And I look forward to learning more about the Speakers Bureau and hopefully participating in it even further. Thank you.